All right. Let me share this screen. Oh, yeah, there we go. Well, welcome everyone. This is the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association's Clean Energy Seminar Series tonight, February 2nd, 2022, and we're going to be talking about climate change in Michigan. Tonight's presentation is by Janice Means, who is a Professor Emeritus Clean Energy at Lawrence Technological University and a newly elected member of the GLREA Board of Directors, and John Freeman, our Executive Director. I'm your host, Mark Clevey. I'm Vice President of the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association. Our financial sponsors for this series includes the Michigan Department of Environmental and Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE, McNaughton and McCoy in Ann Arbor. Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association was formed in 1991 and operates as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. GLREA is supported by our members to educate and advocate for renewable energy in the Great Lakes region. As one of our programs, we operate these series of Zoom programs each month on the Thursdays. On the first Thursday of each month, we do Ann Arbor Solar Stories hosted by Julie Roth, case studies on solar installations in Ann Arbor. On the second Thursday of each month, Clean Energy Seminars hosted by myself. Our third Thursday of each month, Detroit Solar Stories, hosted by Diane Van Buren, who is a member of our board of directors and president of Zachary Associates. And Diane does, similar to Ann Arbor, does case studies on installations in Detroit. And on the fourth Thursday of each month, we have My Solar Stories, which is covering the remainder of the state, hosted by John Sarber, GLREA secretary, who started all this with the first Solar Stories a couple of years ago, and we've all followed suit. Our Clean Energy Seminar Series covers topics of particular interest to clean energy users, businesses, advocates, and stakeholders. Seminars include content ranging from technology to business to public policy. It's a Zoom event held on the second Thursday of each month from 7 to 8. CES related questions and comments and suggestions should be sent directly to me, and my email is there. We ask that you remember to mute yourself and hold all of your questions until the end of the presentation. You can raise your hand under the reaction section to ask a question, and I will call on you personally for your question. Tonight's Clean Energy Seminar is going to discuss the looming crisis of climate change with a particular focus on the Great Lakes region and Michigan. Presentation will lay out up-to-date facts on climate change and public policy related efforts to mitigate its risks in Michigan. Tonight's presenters are, again, Janice Means, who is a Professor Emeritus at Clean Energy at Lawrence Tech. She is the 2021 recipient of GLREA's Melanie McCoy Award, recognizing leading women in Michigan's solar energy industry. For over 30 years, Janice served as a professor. Oh, I got your name spelled wrong there, Janice.
That's okay, I'll forgive you.
At Lawrence Technological University, where she taught courses in solar and other forms of clean energy. She almost single-handedly kept the clean energy fires burning in our state during the dark times of climate change denial and the war on solar by anti-solar forces in the state and in our electric utilities. She has written numerous books and articles, served on national standards boards, setting boards and commissions, served in leadership positions with energy policy organizations, and received numerous awards and accolades for her work, most recently from AEEE. In 2022, again, she was elected to serve on GLREA's board of directors. John Freeman is our esteemed executive director. John's experience includes serving in the Michigan House of Representatives. John's well-versed in the challenges and opportunities associated with climate change risk mitigation in Michigan and the critically important role solar energy can play in such mitigation. I welcome you both to the GLREA's Clean Energy Seminar, and I'll turn this over to Janice.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that introduction. I know you always give me so much credit, more credit, I think, than I deserve sometimes. Can you see my screen? No?
Yes, I can go up there. You can go up to slideshow then.
Okay.
All right. At the top, at the very top, straight up.
It looks different. Okay.
Yes. Hit that. And then you should be able to hit from beginning. There you go.
There we go. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. And I want to mute this to hide this video panel. Oh, that's not what I wanted to hide. I wanted to hide the, there we go. Hello, everyone. So happy to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about climate change. What, why, how, who, where, and when. And I need to tell you that I have been on the ASHRAE, American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, Air Conditioning Engineers, Climate Change Technical Committee, and was one of the co-authors of the climate change chapter. By the way, there's another co-author online right now, and that's Jim Newen. Tonight, we're going to start with the introduction. I'm going to then talk about whether climate change is really human-caused or not. I'll present some key present, future climate outcomes for the U.S. Midwest, and particularly for Michigan. And then I'll define really what mitigation, adaptation, and resilience are, and come up with some concluding remarks. So on the introduction, why, first of all, is climate change literacy important? Well, ASHRAE's position document states that climate change is the most formidable environmental challenge ever faced by society. And we all know that we are in a climate, everyone here anyway knows that we're in a climate crisis right at the moment. But did you know that since 1960, we have been experiencing the raise in heating and raise in carbon dioxide 100 times faster than any time following the last glacial period. So let's talk a little bit about the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and their definition of climate change. I'm going to read this. It's a change in the state of climate that can be identified by changes in the mean and or variability of its properties and that persists for an extended period, typically decades or longer. And this is how it differs from our day-to-day weather. The information that I'm sharing with you, it comes from the IPCC 5th and 6th reports, and also the United States government's 4th National Climate Assessment, which was issued in 2018. It also, I have incorporated what I have learned from climatologists from the ASHRAE Climate Change Technical Committee. And in case any of you are interested, you might want to Google the NCA4 and look at chapter 21 because that specifically goes into greater detail on the impacts of climate change to the Midwest United States. Okay, so to start with, what is climate change and what causes it? Well, it's basically an imbalance in the solar radiation reaching and leaving the Earth. And I know most of you, I'm kind of playing to the choir here, most of you know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Shortwave radiation, the form of light, comes to the Earth, and as the greenhouse gases around the Earth act just like glazing on a greenhouse. In other words, it lets the shortwave radiation through, but when it turns to heat or long-wave radiation, it's reflected back to the Earth. So, what are some of the natural and human drivers of climate change? Well, we have heating done, and when that is larger than the reflections of the cooling, we get the radiative imbalance leading to global warming. And I know you know what a lot of these are, but I do want to point out a couple. Notice I have a volcano in both the heating and the cooling part. Actually, the volcanoes add very little to the heating by sending out global warming, greenhouse gases. Whereas they do, if they put enough particulate into the atmosphere, it blocks the sun. So what are greenhouse gases? Water vapor is probably the largest, most important, and then in order of the rest of them in importance is carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone. And you might hear people say, well, why do they not concentrate on water vapor if that's the most important? Well, what happens is when you have temperatures increasing, you get a lot more water being evaporated into the atmosphere. So that increases the water, which again increases the heating. So it's more of a feedback rather than a forcing function. So let's look at the question now. Is today's climate change anthropogenic? In other words, is it human caused? So I'm proposing that the most significant input is human caused. And it is due to changes in the landscape, the deforestation, the burning of fossil fuels to provide all the energy that we need to do all the things that we do in our world. And also, surprisingly, a lot of methane comes from the beef and the sheep that we eat, primarily the beef, because that is in a greater in our food source in the United States. So is this actually the case? What evidence do we have to show this? So let's take a look. Is it caused only and primarily by natural forces? Because you will hear others saying that, oh, it's caused by solar activity. So let's look at that. Let's look at this graph. This is temperature versus solar activity. We have on the x-axis, we're starting in 1880 and going up to pretty close to the present time. On the left axis, we have the total solar eradication, and on the right, we have degrees Celsius. If we look at the grain that goes up and down, and I don't think you can see me doing my marker, so I'm going to add that, the laser printer. If you see this green going up and down, that is the change in the irradiation, and the stronger yellowish green line shows the 11-year average, okay? Then the red going up and down shows the changes in temperature, and the darker red follows, this darker part shows again, the 11-year average. If we look everything to the left of 1960, it does look like there's a close or relatively close correlation between the two. However, after 1960, we see a divergence on this. In fact, we see the solar irradiation going down. In fact, the climate models predict that we should be cooling, but we're going into a warmer climate. So why is that happening? Let's look at natural Earth cycles. There's something called the Milankovitch cycle, and this has to do with the orbit around the sun that the Earth takes. It can be concentric circle at one time, or excuse me, a circle at one time, and it goes elongated at other times. In addition to that, we have the axis. It varies between a little bit over 22 degrees and 24, a little bit over 24 degrees. At present, we're at 23.45 degrees. I always just tell my students the one thing to remember is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 23.5 degrees. In any case, we also have some wobbling that takes place. And when all of this is happening, it changes how much irradiation is coming to the Earth, which caused the ice ages. If we look at these charts, and on both of these, we're starting at 800,000 years prior to the prior time. And on this chart, we have the carbon dioxide and temperature. Carbon dioxide is shown in the darker blue, and temperature is in the lighter blue. And you can see that things have regularly gone up and down, okay, throughout time from 800,000 years ago. By the way, you're probably asking, how do we know this from 8,000 years ago? Well, there are ice cores that we can drill into in the Antarctic. And when we pull these up, there are little bubbles of air in them, and we can actually take some measurements. Over here on the right, I have the global mean sea level, also from about 800,000 years ago. And if you look at these, this chart will almost fit exactly over that one, which I think is rather interesting. So that shows what's naturally happening. So more recently, things are not happening the way they had come before. And I'm going to go into greater detail in these in a minute, but I wanted to show these particular charts because you may want to go to this site, climatelevels.org, because you can look at the chart and you can click on any point and it'll actually show you what the value was at that time. In any case, global CO2 levels have gone up extremely. The global temperature has gone up. The global mean sea level has gone up. So it's not fitting the pattern, okay? We've had unprecedented warming. This chart goes from 1880 up to pretty close to the present time. And then we have the temperature, and this is in Celsius, okay? Excuse me. From the industrial age of 19th century roughly up, it's been about, the increase in temperature and CO2 has been about 10 times faster than those normal paths. And if we look at the present temperature, it is actually almost over 2.25 degrees Fahrenheit, or on this chart, the equivalent of 1.3 degrees centigrade, and I did plot the rest to bring it up to date, warmer than it was in 1880, okay? Also, the greatest amount of heating, the fastest heating, has taken place since 1960, and you can see that here, how it's been going up. It's actually 100 times, if you can imagine it, 100 times faster than anything that we have been able to understand that happened previously naturally. And I've chosen this also because it contains the 7 warmest years which have occurred, by the way, since 2014. The hottest year being 2016, which tied in 2020. And looking at these, I noticed that they're little bumps coming down, and I remembered the climatologist talking about volcanoes, and I did mention that earlier, that volcanoes do cause, depending on how much they put out, they cause a 4 or 5 year cooling period. And I did find correlation between these dips and the volcanoes that have taken place. The most recent volcano did not put out as much as the 4 that are showing here. So I think we'll see some cooling in the next 4 or 5 years, but maybe not as much as shown here, which I think is kind of interesting. I hope you find it interesting too. Okay, so if we look at climate models, and climate models are not real accurate, and you're going to see a range of values in them. Climate models are good to give us an idea of what might happen, but no one has a crystal ball and knows for sure. But I thought it was interesting that if you took the climate models and looked at the range of natural factors only, which is shown in the green, it shows that we should be, starting to go into a cooling pattern, okay? If we plot, using those same models, the natural and human factors, which is in the blue, and then look at the actual observation, which is shown plotted in black, it really seems to confirm the models, first of all, and show that natural and human factors have made the difference in our present global warming. So let's talk about CO2 levels. And it's interesting, I should say that CO2 levels do vary at different places on Earth, and it also varies by the climate, or excuse me, not by the climate, the season. I'm sorry, I'm still recovering and I'm not speaking as well as I usually do, so bear with me, everyone. So for example, in our winter in North America, it's summer in South America, and South America has a lot more vegetation, the Amazon rainforest, for example, and it pulls in and uses up a lot of that CO2. So in the winter, our CO2 levels in North America are down a bit. But in any case, if we look at the world, and again, going back 800,000 years and looking at a little more detail, we can see that in all the time until very recently, that the CO2 levels did not exceed 280 to say 300 parts per million, and then they zoomed up. And today, and I looked this up, not for today, but February 7th, 3 days ago, the reading was 418 parts per million. To give you an idea of how fast it's moving up, in 2020, we had a high average of 412.5 parts per million, and that was when a lot of people weren't flying, a lot of people weren't doing things they normally do during the pandemic. On May 9th of 2013 was the first time that we exceeded 400 parts per million in 800,000 years. So, and I've mentioned this before, but I can't emphasize it enough. We've had 10 times faster increase in our temperatures and CO2 levels since the mid-19th century, and 100 times faster since 1960, when we compare sources at the end of the last ice age on how fast it warmed up. So this, I think, is what really convinced me, and I think this is very compelling information. Let's look at carbon isotopes. Okay, we can actually tell what the CO2 source is to a certain extent by looking at carbon isotopes. Now, to refresh you on your chemistry, carbon has a atomic weight which is about 12, which means it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons in its nucleus. It also in nature exists in 2 other forms, as carbon-13, which has an extra neutron, and carbon-14, which has 2 extra neutrons in it. Well, if we look at fossil fuel combustion, it produces low carbon-13 fractions and no carbon-14 fractions, okay? So the CO2 levels have greatly increased, and here's another way of looking at it. They're 40% higher in 2019 than they were in 19th century, 47% higher today than they were in the 19th century. But the fraction of the carbon isotopes for 14 and 13 concentration has significantly decreased. So that shows that we have more CO2 that's coming from fossil fuel combustion. Also, the IPCC 6th report, and I'm sure all of you have heard this, but it says it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and the land. And they didn't come to this without putting a lot of thought in it. If you look at the 1990, 95, and reports leading up to the 2021, you see that they were very careful in analyzing whether humans were causing the biggest issues or not. But now they believe that they have, and we're responsible. Also, this is a list of worldwide scientific societies that have claimed the position that climate change is caused by human action. And I don't know how many of you watched when the CEOs of the natural gas and the fossil fuel company CEOs came before Congress to speak, but every single one of them went on and said that they believed that climate change was caused by human action, the burning of fossil fuels, which I thought was amazing, especially all the information that's been put out before by them. So let's look at some key and present potential future climate outcomes. So things, as I have mentioned, is happening at an alarming rate, and even the climatologists using their models did not predict that it would happen as quickly as it's happening. Global temperature, as I mentioned earlier, has increased to over 2.25 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century, and it's expected to increase further. We're getting a lot more extreme weather events. They're more intense and more frequent. We have our fires, forest fires. We have hurricanes. We have more severe storms. A lot of this has to do with the increased moisture in the atmosphere. And by the way, I want to comment on this, especially for Colorado. Colorado and a lot of the western states and even western Canada have been having a lot of forest fires. Part of the reason for that is for pine trees. There's something called the pine beetle that used to die out when the cold temperatures were reached. Well, since it's increased in temperature, the pine beetles are no longer dying out, so they are destroying the pines. The pines then are dying. They're very dry. Combine that with drought and lightning or any spark at all, and you get forest fires. Arctic sea ice is decreasing rapidly. And if you look at the annual minimum, and I want to explain what the annual minimum is. Every year, the sea ice around the Arctic increases, it grows, okay? And then in the summer, it retreats. Well, the minimum is the smallest amount that it is in the summertime, okay? It's down 13.1% per decade. This is a chart for the last, 30 years or so, and it shows how it changes, and it does increase and go down somewhat, but you can see that it's decreasing. And I thought a couple of diagrams from NASA, I think these are based on photographs, but I don't think they're photographs. This is the 1984, what it looked like for the Arctic ice, sea ice. This is what it looked like for 2020. Notice all the extra ocean here. And this is a real problem because as we have ice melting, we're exposing, in this case, seawater, which is darker, which is going to absorb more sunlight and increase the heat. It's also true on land because as the ice melts, it exposes dark soil, which then absorbs the heat. Glaciers are shrinking, and this is from 1984. You can see some of the glaciers, Glacier National Park in Montana. This is from 2015, and I didn't have a picture of something more recent, but you can see they're really disappearing. I think Glacier National Park's going to have to change its name. Okay. In 1975, I drove the Alcan Highway, and on the way there, I stopped to see the Columbia ice fields, and it was amazing. In 1988, my husband and I drove the Alcan Highway again. He was driving. He pulled in, and he said, "We're at the Columbia ice fields." And I said, "No, we're not." It looked so drastically different to me that I couldn't believe it. So in 2017, my husband and I took this picture, and you can see the difference between these. And actually, this is from 2019. It just has melted back so much. And also in the beginning of this century, I visited Alaska again and was at the Mendenhall Glacier. And they had a movie going on showing how the glacier had retreated. And believe it or not, they had a chalkboard up, and they were daily putting down information on how the changes were. And it used to be that no one was allowed to build within a mile of the glacier, and of course now they are. So what happens when glaciers melt? Well, if they're already in seawater, they're not going to affect the sea level. But if they melt and go into the sea, which happens, okay, the global mean sea level rises. It's risen an average of about 9 inches since 1880. That might not sound like a lot to you, but if you lived on an island, in an island country that is just slightly above sea level, it is a problem, especially during storms. On average, since between 1993 and 2020, we had about 0.13 inches per year of rise. Now, I'm going to read this next quote, and I want you to really pay attention to this. It looks like it could reach around almost 2 feet, I'm sort of reading it, by 2100 even if greenhouse gas emissions are sharply reduced and global warming is limited to well below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So what happens if it goes above that? There are predictions of many feet of the rise. And what you might not realize is that 1/3 of the total world population, 1/3, the total world population lives within 60 miles of an ocean. So let's look at something else. Let's look at the climate events and their cost, because we have costs not only monetarily but also in lives. This is the 2021 billion-dollar weather and climate disaster chart. And from 1980 till the end of 21, the United States alone had experienced 310 weather and climate disasters. Now you probably say, well, we probably had more than that. We did. These are 310 weather and climate disasters that each reached cost of $1 billion with a B, or cost more than that. Over 15,000 people have died due to these climate disasters. The cumulative cost was over $2 trillion, that's with a T, dollars. And every state has experienced this. Texas is the largest. They've had 100 of these climate-related events. The average per year since 1980 was 7.4. But look at this. Since 2016, that has greatly increased. We're having an average of 17.2 of these per year throughout the United States. And I'm sure all of you have recognized all the increase in storms, in flooding, for example, that we have had in the Detroit area and other parts of Michigan. Although I might say, I think that Michigan on whole has done better, fared better than other parts of the country when we talk about these events. So let's look at Michigan in particular. This chart is a little bit hard to read, so let me explain how to read it. From 1980 to 2021, it is plotting the Michigan billion-dollar disaster events, okay? The number of these events is counted on the left side, okay? For example, up here, the green and the blue, it comes out to 2 events, okay? On the right side is the actual cost of the event. The squares, like here, the green square, for example, is a severe storm. The purple is actually a winter storm. The blue refers to freezing, the light blue, and then the gold here refers to the drought count. And we have had, parts of us have had drought. Now, the triangular parts of this are showing the cost for each of these events. And then if you follow along this black line, you can see the 5-year average of the cost. And as you can see, it's moving up. Okay? So how many events have we had? We've had 44. And again, these are each one exceeded $1 billion. 30 were due to severe storms, 5 due to winter storms, 5 due to drought, 3 from flooding, 1 from freeze. And I was trying to determine what they meant by freeze and how it was different from winter storms, and I could not find that. So I'll leave it just as freeze. Okay, so what else is happening? If we look at the United States as a total, we can see the areas in the extreme dark red would be getting the hottest, the greatest increase in temperature. The blue, and there's not a lot of it, is showing cooling, okay? So we're getting a little bit of cooling down here, but let's look at where we live and in Michigan. And also I copied the scale up here to make it easier for you to compare the colors. So some areas in Michigan have increased more than the global average for this century. Instead of going up 2.75 degrees, some parts of Michigan look like this. For example, in the Lower Peninsula on the northwest side, I read it as 3.5, 3 to 3.5. It's hard to tell. It looks like it might be the 3.5 to 4, but somewhere in there, we've had an increase in temperature. In addition to that, we can look at precipitation. And my goodness, Michigan, well, all of the Midwest seems to be increasing in precipitation, but look at Michigan here. The western half of Michigan, Lower Peninsula, for the most part, is experiencing 20 to 30% more precipitation than it did since 1901. And that's predicted to increase. So, in summary, for Michigan, our warm season temperatures are going to increase more in the Midwest than any other region in the United States. And I've already showed you parts of Michigan which are affected more than other parts. Lake surface temperatures are increasing also. We have the stratification of seasonal temperatures occurring earlier in the year for our lakes. Summer evaporations are increasing, which makes sense as the temperature goes up, more water is evaporated. Algal bloom is increasing. Okay, lake ice cover is declining. Sorry, you ice fishermen there, or fisher people, I should say. We have increased, with increased precipitation anywhere, it increases the heavy rain events, it increases flooding. Look at Detroit, which had a 1,000-year event just this summer. Detroit and Dearborn were hardest hit. Worsening of effects of invasive species, insect, pest, and plant disease. I could have a whole talk on this. And I did mention already in Colorado, for example, about the pine beetle, but there are other things. We're going to see more disease, and I'm not saying the pandemic is caused to that. I'm not saying that, but we're going to see more disease because of the increase in precipitation and increase in temperature. We also have, because of this, lower air and water quality. Ozone levels are increasing. I'm sure you've heard, especially in the summertime when they say try to stay inside, the ozone levels are high. We didn't used to have that, okay? So let's look at mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And these are how we can handle climate change. And John's going to talk about mitigation following my presentation. But let's see, what does mitigation, adaptation, and resilience really mean? Well, here's an easy way to think of mitigation: avoiding the unmanageable. And this is by replacing fossil fuels with solar and wind, and looking at carbon sequestration. I can comment on that a little later if you'd like me to be. I headed a committee reviewing a report that's going to be put out by ASHRAE soon. So basically, we want to decrease or eliminate carbon dioxide emissions. Adaptation, you can think of this as managing the unavoidable. This has to do with smart design and operational changes. It's primarily in our built societies are dealing with this right now and coming up with ways of adapting to climate change. Resilience, and this is an important one. We need to protect people, buildings, and equipment. We want to maintain our operations while we manage these occurrences, especially these extreme weather occurrences that are coming and are happening. So in conclusion, climate change is happening at a very rapid rate, alarming rates, much faster than was predicted. I believe this climate change is primarily caused by human activities and since the beginning of the industrial age. And I think I hope I have convinced you of that with the scientific data I brought forward. And we need to use strategies to mitigate the effects of climate change, to adapt to the changing climate. In fact, I didn't mention it, but climate zones just in the last few years have moved about 100 miles north, and they even created a new climate zone called O for this hottest area. And we need to provide for resilience, especially when we're talking about all these intense, extreme weather events. And ASHRAE's 2021 Fundamentals Handbook has a new chapter in it called Climate Change. You can go to Lawrence Tech's library and see this for free. And I'd be glad to discuss it further with anyone. And again, I want to give Jim Newman credit. He was one of the co-authors with me. We were the two people that happened to be from the Detroit chapter of ASHRAE. So not addressing climate change is very expensive. We will have greater loss of life and we'll have greater expense. By the way, I didn't mention this before, but more people die from excessive heat than they do from excessive cold. So I can't leave you without giving you some good news. So here's the good news. There's still hope. Every day, people are making themselves more knowledgeable or more climate change literate, I should say, and that's something that I hope that we continue to do. And hopefully our governments are starting to really act on this. And all of you know this, renewable energy has greatly decreased in costs in the last decade, although it does seem to be going up a bit right now with the pandemic. Research is being done to find ways to sequester carbon dioxide, and it is not a solution. It's not something to do in place of getting rid of the burning of fossil fuels, but it will help. If we act now, things aren't going to get any better, but they won't get worse. I thank you for listening, and now John Freeman is going to present on mitigation in Michigan, and our Q&A will follow his presentation. Thank you for listening. And I'm going to stop sharing so that I'll try to stop sharing here. Can you stop me sharing? It doesn't want to, it's not responding to me.
I think only you can do that, Janice.
Only I can do that. Oh,
All
there
you
we
can
go.
do is,
Okay, it didn't
there you
want
go.
to.
Okay.
It didn't want to let me do it. Stop share. There we go.
There you go.
Okay,
All right.
thank you. Sorry about that.
Outstanding. Excellent.
Okay,
John,
I'm
you
going to
ready?
go. This is John Freeman, and I just want to thank Janice for making an amazing presentation. A lot of very helpful information. I'm going to be really quick because I want people to have an opportunity to ask questions. And my basic part of this presentation is what is happening in Michigan. And I think there are basically 4 major things happening in Michigan that immediately are addressing climate change. And a lot of them is in fact what GLREA is doing as a part of our mission. You know, the first major thing is decarbonization of energy. We're going through a transition from fossil fuels that generates electricity and powers our cars, which generates a lot of pollution in terms of carbon that goes in the air and contributes to climate change, like Janice just talked about. So we are promoting renewable energy, wind and solar, and we're actively working to shut down coal plants, which is a huge source of carbon pollution. Now, the key point I want to give everybody is that this transition is not going to be easy. There's always a struggle when we're talking about major social change, because they're going to be winners and they're going to be losers. And some of the losers are, in fact, fossil fuel corporations, which have a tremendous amount of money. You know, as we transition to electric cars, we're not going to be buying gasoline and oil. And goodness knows, we know how much power the oil companies have regarding, you know, politicians in Washington and, for that matter, foreign policy in the Middle East. So that's a huge factor. But nonetheless, we've seen major changes going on with electric vehicles, and that's very encouraging. We've seen that the utilities in Michigan, we obviously fight them on many issues, but they are in fact closing down coal plants, and they are in fact incorporating more wind and solar to their energy production. So slowly over time, and we're trying to nudge them along, they're transitioning how they produce electricity. There's now a lot more of attention going on about having electrical heat for homes and businesses, because most houses and businesses are heated by natural gas, which may not be as bad as coal in terms of producing 50% less carbon than coal, but nonetheless, it still is an emitter of carbon dioxide and methane. So we need to, we need to electrify our homes and businesses and get electrical heat. And then as the production of electricity becomes sources that are renewable, then that will be a real savings in the long run. The most immediate thing that's going on in Michigan is that the governor has released a draft report. It's called the Draft Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. And this document is freely available, and I would encourage all of you to try and track it down. I sent an email a couple of weeks ago with a link to it to all the members. So if you all keep the emails I send you, which I'm sure you all do, because there's such nuggets and you know good for posterity. But and all jest aside, there is a link to it. And the reason why it's important to look at it is that the governor and her people want feedback on the plan. Now, this is a political document. The goal of this document is to come up with a plan for 100% carbon neutrality by 2050. But in the more immediate goal, they want 52% reduction by 2030. So this is essentially a blueprint in how to get there. And that is why I call it a political document, because with the governor's stamp of approval on it, it then becomes something that we can use to gauge the progress we're making as we transition from fossil fuels and fossil fuel powered cars to electric vehicles, renewable energy for homes and for the utilities. And so this document's going to be out there, and we can use it to hold the legislators, we can hold the future governors, we can hold the Public Service Commission, and for that matter, private corporations accountable by this document. And so what we're trying to do is to beef up this document, make it stronger, as strong as we possibly can in order to make it even more powerful of an argument. Now, in terms of making comments, GLREA will be formally sending comments in probably about a week. The deadline for commenting on this plan is now March 14th. It was going to be right about now when it was originally put out, but there's been such overwhelming public response in terms of making comments that a few days ago, or late last week, the governor and her people decided to push back the deadline for comments almost a month to March 14th. And they've held a couple of public Zoom meetings where people can give oral comments as well. And the next one of these is on February 14th from 6 to 8 o'clock in the evening. And the links are available to sign up, and you just need to Google it, you can find it. So I would really encourage all of you to look at this document. It's about 45 pages. It's fairly simple reading. It's a lot of graphic design work, a lot of bold headlines and easy to read paragraphs, but it is an interesting document. And this is the first governor. I give Governor Whitmer a lot of credit for trying to put forth such a blueprint to try and decarbonize the state. So I will stop there, and then let's open up for questions for the last 12 minutes. Back to you, Mark.
Again, please go to reactions, and at the bottom of it, you can raise your hand and ask questions.
We do have a question that was added in chat, so why don't you
go for it?
That one first. Do you want to read it, or you want me to?
Go ahead, you do it, Janice.
Okay, this is from John Richter. It says, do you have any thoughts you could share on geoengineering, such as iron seeding the oceans or adding particulates high in the atmosphere to increase reflection of solar radiation back into space? We did address this very cursively in the climate change chapter for the ASHRAE Fundamentals Handbook. I am very nervous about geoengineering. When I look at other things that we have brought animals in to take care of other animals. For example, in New Zealand, they brought raccoons in to handle something, I forget which, and now they're overrun by raccoons. They hate raccoons. And this has happened too many times. We've brought species in, and this goes for plants too, brought them into an area where they were not native, non-native plants, and what happens, they end up taking over. So I'm very suspicious of geoengineering and not fond of it, but I'm still open to listen.
How
So
about you, Charles? Got a question?
Yeah, I have just a question is, I know New York City is one of the least, has the lowest carbon footprints of any city in the United States because they have so many apartments. And I don't
Right.
know if GLREA or there's other, in terms of, I know because when people are living together like that in an apartment setting, there's a radiant heat that goes from one to the other. And I'm sure ASHRAE has dealt with this, but I mean, as far as a solution going forward, Janice, do you have any thoughts?
well, it is true that you use less energy when you're in, say, an apartment building. For one thing, if you're looking at the heat loss and heat gain, you have less surface area. Like, if I may get a little technical, heat transfer is equal to the rate of change of heat travel times the area and the difference in the temperature. So if you decrease the area that's exposed from there, then you're going to have less heat transfer going through. So that in itself does it. Plus, there's the whole thing about using less energy for traveling. You know, many people can walk or take mass transit more easily in a city, especially New York. Who wants a car in New York, right? So I guess I could say more about it, but that's about it. I don't want to belinger it. Does that kind of answer what you probably already know this, Charles? Yeah, thank you.
I would say that we had a meeting today with the city of Ann Arbor, and I was on a decarbonization work group, and we had an interesting conversation with a group representing landlords of commercial buildings in Ann Arbor, and the question was electrification versus what they're doing now with natural gas. There is a sharp cost curve to electrification on existing buildings, and I think to expect that the landlords are going to just jump up and do this, I think we're kidding ourselves. So the implementation of, it's one thing to stop new buildings and require electrification on new buildings, but we got a lot of old buildings, and they're not going to change that unless we induce them to do so, either financially or through some regulatory thing. And I can't see it happening from regulation. So it's going to be an interesting challenge in every city. Other questions, comments?
There must be some questions out there.
People are stunned.
Was
So
everything, any questions on anything that I covered that was hard to
Dale.
understand or anything?
Dale's got a question. So does
Thanks.
Kate. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Dale.
I just wondered, I'm not sure who the best person to answer this is, but is Ann Arbor's climate action plan realistic? Are we really going to get to 50% by 2050 without people completely changing their lifestyles?
I think the answer is that people are going to have to change. And if you look at Janice's adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, we need to manage the unavoidable, and we need to maintain operations. So I guess my answer is we can do it the easy way or the hard way. But either way, we're going to change. And the Ann Arbor Climate Action Plan is an outstanding pathway, and a lot of people are working on it. There are formidable barriers, University of Michigan being one. So it's going to be interesting. Just, the largest skybox holder at University of Michigan is DTE Energy, and they buy their power from DTE, and DTE is more than happy to sell them green power, and more than happy to charge their EV chargers with methane powered electricity. So it's going to get interesting. How about Kate?
I'm a member of 350.org, and 350 was at one point the limit, 350 parts per million.
Yes.
And now we're over.
Remember those days?
We're over 4. Jean, do you know if, I'm sorry, I keep calling you Jean, Janice Means.
That's okay.
Is there a new number now? Maybe all trying to go lower.
Well, after the 350, they said below 400. And
Right.
what is happening right now is it's not going to get any better. There was a chance to where we could make it better. We can't make it better, but we can maintain. But we have to act now. Have to
Yeah.
act. And one thing that I think that governments in like cities, everybody needs to understand is it costs more to do nothing than it does to do something. Look at those $1 billion uh, events going on, and people are dying.
Right.
To my opinion, it costs more to do nothing than it does to do something. And the whole, or part of the argument that has been used in the past is it's too expensive to do anything about climate change.
Right.
But I think it's the exact opposite. My
Excellent
opinion.
point.
And
Selena, Lucas?
that's frankly why we need to turn loose the private sector and let the markets drive a lot of this social change. If we
Exactly.
continue to have governments that subsidize fossil fuels, then that will slow the transition down. But if we actually can let the market decide that since renewable energy, solar in particular, and wind is so much cheaper to produce than natural gas and coal, then we will see an accelerated change because the market is pushing it and people will save money and they'll do the right thing in promoting a cleaner environment. So we just got to, in some cases, get the government out of the way, and we got to stop DTE from buying off politicians.
Here, here.
I'd like to add more, if I could, before the next question. Right now, it is less expensive to build a solar facility to generate electricity than it is to build a new coal plant. Isn't that
Yes.
amazing? And also, even years ago, when Mark and I were on, I think we're getting a lot of, is that my echo that I'm hearing? Or is someone talking?
Somebody's talking.
If people would turn off their mics, please. Okay. When Mark and I were on the Michigan Solar Energy Association, which is kind of the predecessor to GLREA, I remember that the utility companies would say, well, we can't subsidize solar. And all the time we've been subsidizing, fossil fuels. It's like we've subsidized the tobacco growers and then spent all this money on getting people to stop smoking. The whole thing is so crazy. But anyway, I just had to share that. And let's go to the next question. Thank you.
I think
Selena,
Marcia's
Lucas,
got a
you're up.
question, Mark. Marcia Curran's got a question.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry, I came in kind of late. Very interesting presentation. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you.
I have a crazy idea. Maybe it is crazy. There are all these gasoline cars on the road, and we're still selling a lot more of those than EVs. I suppose, I don't know if it would be cheaper to try to sort of transform them. Somebody could start a business transforming them into EVs, getting rid of the internal combustion engine in the car and doing, or is it just as expensive to buy a new EV? I don't know.
There are businesses that do that.
I mean, if we could support that, because there are just a lot of people who aren't going to be able to afford an EV in the next 10 or 15 years. And it seems like, we're still going to have all those things on the road, and they're going to be burning gasoline, and they're not very efficient, a lot of them. So
when cars first came out, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Anybody working on something like that? I mean, of course, you'd need a lot of batteries, and we're having trouble getting all the stuff.
Right.
Yeah, that's another whole issue. In fact, I think storage is the biggest issue that we have, for when we talk about solar and wind. Storage is the biggest issue. But did you know that some of the first cars were electric cars?
Absolutely. The first Mercedes was.
In New York State, there were more places for you to charge an electric car. I wish I have the date. I don't remember the date. Than there are right now, which is crazy. It's just crazy.
Yes.
And I think Selena and Dave have had their hands up.
We got two more questions here. Selena, go ahead.
Thanks. I have kind of a two-part. One is about DTE. I do have solar. I'm grid tied. Unfortunately, I need another storage battery to get rid of it. But in the meantime, they've just blessed me with that distribution charge. I'm wondering if that proposal has a likelihood to pass. So that's question number one. Question number two, Janice, is you alluded to carbon sequestration. I'm familiar with no-till, and I'm wondering what else like can day-to-day people do besides how we garden.
I'm going to have John answer the first part, but John, do you mind if I go first in answering about sequestration?
Go for it.
Okay, there are there are about 8 or 10 processes, or that you could call them processes. They're being looked at. Some of them are further along than others. Some are taking cement and pulverizing it. Some of them are actually embedding carbon into cement.
Yeah.
There are, oh wow, there's so many different ones. Doing natural things, which we can do, like having green roofs. Okay, that's part of sequestration too. Reforestation. Afforestation. Afforestation is putting forests in that haven't been there before, whereas reforestation is rebuilding, if you will, replanting a forest. There are many, many ways. As soon as the report comes out, if you send me an email and ask me to share it with you when ASHRAE actually publishes, I'll be glad to share it. It's 5 pages long, and we had about 10 different ways of doing it. Some of them were making chemical, electrical changes from the CO2, turning it into something else, okay, and being able to use that, for example. There's several. Anyway, I'd be glad to share that. In fact, maybe I'll make a point to share that on our website once it comes out. And I'm expecting it to come out in the next few months.
Maybe we can get you and
Okay.
Jim to come back and do
Thank
a
you.
session on that, Janice. That'd be good.
And
We'd like
Selena, to answer your question, DTE just filed the rate case about 3 weeks ago with that proposed change in the distributive generation tariff. The committee that GLRE has to discuss it, we're going to get involved in this case and fight tooth and nail. We've already filed for intervention. There'll be another dozen or so groups that will be involved with this proposal. And DTE essentially made the same proposal, slightly different, about 4 years ago in June of 2018. And the Public Service Commission turned them flatly down. And the Public Service Commission supported the current distributive generation tariff. And so, you know, we're optimistic that we can defeat this, but it's going to be a long haul. And the process takes 10 months to complete it. And we're at the very beginning of this case. So we will be having a meeting specifically on this case that John Richter is going to run. It will probably be held on a Tuesday evening. We are running out of Thursdays for all the things that GLREA wants to talk about. And so we're going to be moving to additional seminars on Tuesday evening. And one of the early ones we're going to talk about is this DTE case, because it is pretty outrageous, and we're all going to have to work hard to defeat it.
Thank you.
Selena, you should know that City of Ann Arbor is one of the groups that's going to be intervening in that case as well.
Awesome.
All right, Kyle, is it Gaia? Oh.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I heard John was saying the thing we need to do is get the governments out of the way and let the free markets take over, but it seems like that doesn't make any sense to me. You know, I have solar panels on my roof because I got a tax benefit from it. And when I think about why electric cars are taking off around the world, it's because so many places have said, we're going to eliminate the gas car. That's the government intervention. Now, I'm not a big fan of governments in people's individual lives, but I think that, you know, what's happening in Ann Arbor is happening because, not because the government got out of the way. And so I'm just going to make sense out of what John was saying.
Well, just respond,
I'm
Gaia.
wondering if he has any more
I was being
add
slightly
to that.
flippant when I made that comment. You know, government can either be very supportive in promoting social change, or they can be a hindrance in promoting social change. And right now, DTE and Consumers Energy has prevented very important legislation from moving forward in the legislature. And so as a result of that, of these bills not passing, the effort to expand distributive generation is slowing down because it's harder to justify it through economics. And so what I mean by government getting out of the way essentially is if government would promote positive policies, then that will promote people to install energy on their homes just like you did.
Right.
But the problem is that the utilities have tremendous amount of political influence because they give a lot of campaign dollars. And so that is what we're facing right now in Lansing. And frankly, the same fight's happening in Washington, D.C., where Joe Biden wants to move some major legislation, but Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, he and the lady senator from Arizona are single-handedly holding it up. And so, and this is a case where, you know, government is not helping us, but we need it to work with us. So stay tuned for news from GLREA, because we're going to get involved with trying to elect legislators that will stand up to the utilities.
I see that there's some other questions that have been added in the chat. Gaia said, John, she was asking John, is it too late to stop by any means? And I guess you did answer that on there. I don't know if you want to say anything to the group, or they can read the chat.
Well, the only thing I want to say is that the question was, she heard rumors that DTE was building this monster natural gas plant. And it's true, they are. It's over in, it's the Blue Water something or other. And 3 years ago, before a utility can build a new massive plant, they have to get a certificate of necessity from the Public Service Commission. In other words, they have to get permission to build a new plant. And 3 years ago, the Public Service Commission, which was a different Public Service Commission then, it was the one that Governor Snyder, for the most part, appointed. And so they were more conservative in their view of the world, and they granted the certificate of necessity for DTE to build this natural gas plant. Now then, gas plants are good for 50 years, and it's very possible that if renewable energy continues to decrease in price, and at the same time, going back to Gaia's point, if in fact government continues to more tightly regulate natural gas as a pollution for carbon dioxide, like Janice was talking, then that may force DTE to close this natural gas plant down earlier, in which case it will become a stranded asset, in which case DTE will go to the Public Service Commission and ask permission to charge all of us extra money in order to pay off the asset that they built. So there are possibilities of closing it down the road, but right now they pretty much got a green light to go ahead to do it. And frankly, you know, DTE will argue that it's a bridge fuel. So that is something to be said, that they are closing down coal plants much quicker than even they were promoting 4 years ago. And they're replacing it with this natural gas plant. So it is better, but it's not the best. And that's why we have to keep struggling to promote renewable energy.
Agree. Okay, Michael Buza had asked, he said, we are at 417 right now. He's talking about parts per million. Yeah, we are way above where we ever thought it would be. And then, let's see. John, I don't know if you want to answer this one from Clyde. Any thoughts on integrating PV solar project with carbon credits?
The renewable energy credit market, which was established back in 2008, it was a helpful factor in promoting renewable energy, but the amount of renewable energy has grown so exponentially that those renewable energy credits are really not worth much anymore, and that market is essentially collapsed. Now, if the federal government or even the state government decided to do a carbon tax, so to speak, and come up with some other way that maybe it could be, Clyde, but at this point, again, we having challenges because both at the state and national level, the fossil fuel industries are trying to slow this movement down as much as they can. So again, we have to keep working and struggling, but we have the angels are on our side in this fight. So that's what keeps us all going.
There are a few other comments, but I'm going to jump down to Peter Bergeon. And I'm sorry if I butchered your last name. Janice, would you comment on the future of nuclear for energy? At one time, I was very much against nuclear energy, mostly because I wasn't sure if we could safely store the what's left over. Okay, I feel very differently now. I think that nuclear is viable. We've lost a lot of time in putting in new nuclear plants, but I personally think it's a good idea. I'm interested to know how many of you think nuclear is good right now. Maybe raise your hand.
I
Do you
don't.
think nuclear is good? You
I
don't? Okay, interesting. Why not, John?
Well, first of all, just like you said a minute ago, there is no solution for the nuclear waste in this country. Yucca Mountain in Nevada is not a repository. And so all this nuclear waste is currently being stored at the plants where it's being used. Like there's a whole bunch of it down at Fermi too. And more importantly, is that if you talk about subsidization, the federal government has been subsidizing the nuclear power industry ever since the Second World War. And so if you want nuclear energy to compete on the open market with renewable energy, it's a slam dunk that solar and wind is so much better. Now, the only factor about nuclear energy is that it's base load. It runs 24 hours a day. But Janice also mentioned, though, that with the increased technology regarding energy storage, that we can generate the renewable energy during the day, we can store it and then feed it back into the grid at night. So there are new techniques now that are available that weren't available 40 or 50 years ago. We should probably wrap this up, though, because it's 8:12. And so I just want to turn it back over to Mark.
Done a great job, you guys. Janice, so thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I think everyone can clearly see you came to where you're